I was given a glass of Kool-Aid, and so were the other children. This Kool-Aid was spiked with LSD. It was horrible.
My father was a victim of Dr. Cameron. He was a 27-year-old healthy skier, canoeer, very athletic, and he had asthma. They told him if he went to the Allen Memorial, they could cure his asthma.
My father, Charles, was a patient of Dr. Cameron's. He had a trigeminal neuralgia, it's called, where there's a pain in the temple that radiates into the jaw that apparently is excruciatingly painful. They told him that it was psychosomatic, which it's not, but in those days, what did they know? So they sent him to a shrink. This shrink that he went to was working with Cameron, although we didn't know. So he put my father right into the program.
I was having trouble with my parents. My father and my stepmother decided to put me in the Allen Memorial Institute. They had no idea what went on in there. I was 16 when I was there.
There are crimes that leave visible scars. And then there are those that leave people questioning whether their memories were ever truly their own. MKUltra belongs to the second category. For decades, it existed not as a story told to the public, but as an absence, an outline hinted at by redacted files, broken testimonies, and lives that never fully returned to what they once were. It was not announced. It was not debated. It was not explained. It simply happened. And for many of its victims, it never truly ended. A world obsessed with control. To understand how MKUltra began, you first have to understand the fear that shaped the era. The mid-20th century was not just a time of geopolitical rivalry. It was a time of psychological paranoia. Governments were no longer afraid only of weapons or armies. They were afraid of ideas, persuasion, influence. The greatest threat, they believed, was not force. It was control of the human mind. Could a person be convinced to betray their beliefs? Could loyalty be rewritten? Could memory itself be altered? These were not fringe questions. They were central to national security thinking. And once those questions were asked seriously, the next step followed naturally. Someone had to find the answers. The program without a face. MKUltra was never meant to be a public project. It had no press releases, no official launch, no clear paper trail. Even its name, clinical, coded, deliberately meaningless, was designed to obscure rather than explain. It existed across universities, hospitals, military facilities, and research institutions, often disguised as unrelated studies. Many of the people involved in its execution did not know they were participating in a larger program at all. And many of the people subjected to it didn't know they were part of anything. They thought they were patients, volunteers, students, or simply people in the wrong place at the wrong time. The victims, no one was looking for. One of the most unsettling aspects of MKUltra is not what was done, but who it was done to. Not enemy agents, not captured operatives, ordinary people. Some sought medical help. Some answered advertisements. Some trusted authority figures without question. Others were never given a choice. They did not sign up to have their sense of reality disrupted. They did not consent to confusion, fear, or long-term psychological consequences. In many cases, they didn't even know anything unusual had happened, until much later, when something felt permanently off. The slow unraveling of self. For those affected, the experience was rarely dramatic in the moment. There was no single event that clearly marked the beginning of harm. Instead, it crept in quietly. A growing sense of disorientation, memories that felt unreliable, emotions that no longer responded predictably. Some described feeling as though a part of themselves had been misplaced. Others spoke of an internal fracture, like a mirror cracked just enough to distort everything reflected back. The most terrifying part wasn't fear, it was uncertainty. When you can't trust your own mind, where do you turn? After the experiment ends officially, Many experiments concluded without incident. Participants were released. Patients were discharged. Subjects returned to their lives. But something followed them home. Relationships changed. Careers faltered. Sleep became unreliable. Some struggled to explain what was wrong. Others stopped trying altogether. When they sought answers, they were often told nothing unusual had occurred, that they were imagining it, that stress was to blame, that memory is fragile by nature. Gaslighting did not need to be intentional to be effective. The weight of not being believed. For victims, the damage wasn't limited to what happened during the program. It continued afterward, in the silence. There were no support systems, no acknowledgements, no admissions of responsibility. Those who tried to speak were dismissed, ignored, or quietly discredited. Without documentation, their stories were treated as unreliable. After all, how do you prove something that was designed to leave no trace? The absence of evidence became evidence against them. Fragments begin to surface. Years later, fragments of the truth began to emerge, not through transparency, but through accident. Misfiled documents, forgotten records, partial disclosures during unrelated investigations. Even then, much had already been destroyed. What remained was incomplete, enough to confirm something happened, but not enough to fully explain it. For victims, this partial truth was its own form of cruelty. Validation came with no closure. What this story is really about, MKUltra, is often framed as a story of secret research and government overreach. But that framing misses the core truth. This is not a story about what an institution attempted to learn. It is a story about what people lost: trust, stability, a clear sense of self. For some, these losses lasted a lifetime. Why this case still matters. The legacy of MKUltra is not confined to the past. It raises questions that remain deeply uncomfortable. What does informed consent truly mean? How much power should institutions hold over individuals? What happens when secrecy overrides accountability? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how many people never realized what was done to them? For many victims of MKUltra, the most damaging moment wasn't when something began. It was when they later realized they had never truly agreed to anything at all. Consent on paper existed. Consent in reality did not. Between those two ideas lay a gap wide enough to swallow lives. How ordinary spaces became silent traps. One of the reasons MKUltra remained hidden for so long was its setting. There were no secret underground chambers, no dramatic, isolated facilities carved into mountains. Instead, it unfolded in places people already trusted: hospitals, university campuses, research clinics, private offices that looked no different from any other. The familiarity lowered defenses. It made questions feel unnecessary. Authority blended seamlessly into the environment. When something feels routine, people rarely suspect harm. The language of reassurance. Victims later described how procedures were explained using calm, professional language. Phrases like standard research, routine observation, minimal risk, temporary effects. Nothing sounded alarming. In fact, many participants believed they were contributing to science or receiving legitimate treatment. Some felt proud to help. Others felt relieved someone was finally listening to them. The language wasn't technically false, it was incomplete. And incompleteness can be just as deceptive as a lie. Power imbalance by design, MKUltra relied heavily on imbalance. Doctor and patient, researcher and subject, institution and individual. In these dynamics, questioning authority felt inappropriate, sometimes even dangerous. If a doctor said something was safe, who were you to argue? If a researcher dismissed discomfort, maybe you were overreacting. If concerns arose, they were often reframed as symptoms rather than warnings. Doubt was pathologized. Trust was assumed. The disappearing line between treatment and experiment. For some victims, the boundary between care and experimentation dissolved entirely. They entered systems seeking help. What they encountered instead was observation without transparency. Symptoms were noted, reactions were recorded, changes were monitored, but explanations were rarely given. This ambiguity created a strange psychological limbo, one where people felt both seen and unheard at the same time. Something was happening to them, but they were never told what. When memory became unreliable. As time passed, many victims struggled to articulate their experiences, not because nothing happened, but because recollection itself became fragmented. Memories felt incomplete, timelines blurred. Certain periods seemed inaccessible. This made reporting difficult. When accounts lack clarity, they are easy to dismiss. And when a person doubts their own memory, challenging authority becomes nearly impossible. The program didn't need to silence people directly. Confusion did the work for them. Isolation as a consequence. Another pattern emerged across victim accounts: isolation. Friends noticed changes but didn't understand them. Family sensed distance but couldn't name it. Relationships strained under unspoken tension. Explaining what felt wrong was difficult when the experience itself lacked clear edges. Some victims stopped trying. Silence became a coping mechanism. The absence of follow-up. When participation ended, it ended abruptly. There were no long-term check-ins, no mental health follow-ups tied to the research, no acknowledgement that after effects were possible. From the institution's perspective, the study was complete. From the victim's perspective, something had only just begun. This disconnect widened the gap between experience and accountability. Early attempts to speak out. A small number of individuals attempted to raise concerns, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later. They were met with bureaucratic delays, dismissive responses, or complete silence. Without access to records, their claims lacked proof. Without proof, they lacked credibility. The system that had observed them so carefully now failed to see them at all. Why oversight failed? MKUltra did not thrive because everyone involved was malicious. It thrived because oversight was fragmented. Projects were compartmentalized. Responsibility was diffused. No single authority had full visibility. This structure made it easy to avoid accountability and easy for individuals within the system to claim ignorance. When everyone is responsible, no one is. The emotional aftermath. Victims often described a lingering sense of betrayal, not just by institutions, but by their own expectations. They believed systems existed to protect them. They believed consent mattered. They believed harm would be acknowledged. When those beliefs collapsed, the emotional impact extended beyond the original experience. Trust itself became difficult. This chapter of MKUltra is not about dramatic moments or shocking revelations. It is about erosion, of clarity, of trust, of agency. It shows how harm does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in professionalism, buried in paperwork, and disguised as progress. In the next chapter, we will move further into the long-term consequences, how some victims spend years attempting to understand what had happened to them, and how partial disclosures changed everything without fully repairing anything. This is where silence meets truth, and neither leaves cleanly. For many victims, the most difficult part of MKUltra did not occur during their involvement. It came afterward, long after the paperwork was filed, long after participation supposedly ended, long after institutions considered their role complete. This was when people were left alone with questions they couldn't answer, when life refused to return to normal. Some victims initially believed they could simply move on. They returned to work, reconnected with family, resumed routines. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Concentration felt harder. Emotional responses felt delayed or exaggerated. Moments of familiarity suddenly felt distant, as if viewed through glass. These changes were subtle enough to be dismissed, but persistent enough to disrupt daily life. The feeling of being out of sync. A recurring description appeared across testimonies. A sense of being slightly out of step with the world, not disconnected entirely, not detached from reality, just misaligned. People described feeling as though conversations moved faster than their thoughts, or slower. Decisions that once felt automatic now required effort. Simple emotions became difficult to identify. This disorientation did not announce itself dramatically. It lingered quietly. Memory as an unstable ground memory issues were among the most troubling consequences. Some victims reported blank periods they couldn't account for. Others remembered events but doubted their accuracy. Certain experiences felt emotionally distant, as if they belonged to someone else. This created a unique psychological tension. When memory becomes unreliable, identity follows. Who are you if your own past feels uncertain? Trying to explain the unexplainable. Many victims attempted to describe their experiences to professionals, doctors, therapists, counselors, but without context, their accounts sounded fragmented, inconsistent timelines, vague sensations, emotional responses without clear cause. Without documentation, these descriptions were often interpreted as unrelated psychological struggles. The original cause remained invisible, and invisibility breeds misinterpretation. Relationships under quiet strain. Personal relationships were often the first to suffer. Partners sensed emotional distance but couldn't identify why. Friends noticed personality shifts without explanation. Family members struggled to reconcile who the person had been with who they seem to be now. When someone cannot explain what changed, others fill in the blanks. Misunderstandings grew. Isolation followed. The cost of self-doubt. Perhaps the most damaging effect was internal. Victims began to question themselves. Was this just stress? Was it imagination? Was something always wrong, and they had simply never noticed before? When authority denies wrongdoing, self-doubt fills the space it leaves behind, and self-doubt can be more corrosive than denial. The first hints of a larger pattern. Years later, some victims began noticing similarities in others' stories. Shared symptoms, parallel experiences, unusual overlaps in treatment locations or timeframes. At first, these connections felt coincidental, then unsettling, then impossible to ignore. Individually, their experiences could be dismissed. Collectively, they formed a pattern. When silence cracks, for some, the realization came gradually. For others, it arrived suddenly, through a news article, a leaked document, or a passing reference that felt uncomfortably familiar. Words they had never heard before suddenly carried weight. Program names, research codes, institutional references. The silence surrounding their experiences began to fracture. Validation without resolution, learning that something had happened, did not bring relief. It brought anger, confusion, grief. Validation arrived stripped of clarity. Records were incomplete, details obscured, responsibility diffused. The truth was enough to confirm harm, but not enough to explain it fully. This partial acknowledgement became its own burden. The emotional weight of being right. Some victims described a strange emotional reversal. They had been right all along. Something had happened. But being right didn't restore what was lost. It didn't repair trust. It didn't stabilize memory. It didn't undo years of uncertainty. Being believed came too late to feel like justice. A lifetime of unanswered questions. Even decades later, many victims remained unsure how deeply they had been affected, which fears were theirs and which had been shaped, which memories were authentic and which were altered, which emotional responses were natural and which were conditioned. These questions had no clear answers, and unanswered questions tend to echo. MKUltra's harm cannot be measured solely by what occurred during its operation. Its true impact lies in the years that followed, in fractured identities, in lost confidence, in lives spent questioning what was real. This was not a temporary disruption. For many, it became a permanent uncertainty. In the next chapter, we move closer to exposure, how the program began to unravel, how secrecy collapsed, not through honesty, but through error, and how public revelation changed everything and fixed almost nothing. This is where silence breaks and consequences finally begin. For years, MKUltra existed only as a rumor, something whispered about, hinted at, never fully acknowledged. Then quietly, the silence broke, not because the truth was offered freely, not because responsibility was accepted, but because secrecy failed. The first glimpses of something hidden, the earliest public hints did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. They appeared as fragments, a reference buried in an unrelated investigation, a line item in a document that didn't belong, a name that meant nothing until it meant everything. At first, these pieces were easy to dismiss. They lacked context, they lacked narrative. But for some victims, they felt familiar in a way that was impossible to ignore. When documentation became dangerous, as inquiries deepened, officials discovered something troubling. Records existed, but not enough. Large portions had been destroyed. Others were heavily redacted. Some were deliberately vague, offering just enough information to confirm activity without explaining it. This destruction was later framed as routine, but routine erasure has consequences. When documentation disappears, accountability follows it. Public revelation without full disclosure. Eventually, MKUltra was named, not explained, not unpacked, just acknowledged. The revelation confirmed what many victims had long suspected, but it arrived stripped of detail. The public learned that something had happened. They did not learn how, why, or to whom in full. This partial truth created a strange divide. For institutions, acknowledgement marked an end. For victims, it marked a beginning. The emotional impact of being confirmed. For those who had spent years doubting themselves, confirmation was overwhelming. Relief collided with anger. Validation collided with grief. They had not imagined it. They had not exaggerated. They had not been mistaken. But recognition came without repair. There were no clear explanations, no full lists of participants, no comprehensive accounts of impact. Truth arrived incomplete. The problem with "we didn't know." As more details surfaced, a familiar defense emerged: fragmentation, compartmentalization, plausible deniability. Individuals claimed they had only seen small pieces. Departments claimed limited awareness. Leadership distanced itself from specifics. This diffusion of responsibility made accountability elusive. When harm is spread across systems, blame becomes abstract, and abstraction protects power. Victims confront the narrative. Some victims attempted to insert themselves into the public conversation. They shared their experiences, sought acknowledgement, asked to be included in the historical record. What they encountered instead was skepticism. Their stories were emotional, their memories fragmented, their timelines imperfect. In contrast, institutions spoke with calm authority, and calm often sounds more credible than pain. Legal recognition without resolution. In limited cases, responsibility was formally recognized, but recognition did not equal understanding. Settlements occurred quietly. Statements were carefully worded. Admissions avoided specificity. For victims, this felt like another layer of silence, one shaped by legality rather than secrecy. Justice, when filtered through caution, loses its power to heal. The public moves on as headlines faded. Public attention shifted elsewhere. New scandals emerged. New crises demanded focus. MKUltra became a historical reference, something unsettling, but distant. For victims, this shift was devastating. Their story had finally surfaced, and almost immediately, it was replaced. Living with a name for the harm. Knowing the name of what had happened did not bring closure. It brought new questions. What exactly had been done to them? Which effects were linked and which were unrelated? How much of their life had been shaped by something they never agreed to? The name MKUltra offered context, but not clarity. It labeled the wound without explaining its depth. The limits of declassification. Declassification is often mistaken for transparency. In reality, it is selective. What was released answered some questions while raising many more. Key records were gone forever. Others were too vague to be useful. History was reconstructed from fragments, and fragments rarely tell a complete story. A shift in power. Too late for the first time, institutions were forced to respond publicly. But the response came after the damage. Policies changed, oversight increased, language softened. Yet these changes offered little comfort to those already affected. Protection arrived after exposure. For victims, the timing felt cruelly ironic. Exposure does not automatically lead to resolution. Truth, when delayed, loses some of its power. MKUltra's revelation did not undo harm. It documented it, partially, cautiously, and too late. The silence broke, but the echo remained. In the final segment, we will step back and examine the long shadow MKUltra left behind, not just on individuals, but on ethics, trust, and the relationship between institutions and the human mind. This is where the story ends, and where its questions refuse to. When MKUltra officially ended, there was no ceremony, no closing statement, no collective reckoning, no moment where the people affected were gathered and told the truth. The program faded from operation, but it did not disappear. It lingered, in memories that felt unreliable, in records that no longer existed, and in lives that never fully returned to what they had been before. The problem with endings. Most historical narratives rely on clean conclusions. A program ends, a policy changes, a chapter closes. But MKUltra did not end that way. For the institutions involved, it became history. For the victims, it remained present tense. An experience does not stop affecting a person simply because it stops being acknowledged. Living with an altered inner world. For many victims, the most enduring consequence was not a specific symptom. It was a shift in how they related to their own minds. Thoughts no longer felt private in the way they once had. Emotions felt suspect. Were they natural or shaped? Memories felt fragile, as if they could fracture under scrutiny. This created a lifelong tension. When your own inner world feels compromised, certainty becomes difficult. trust as a casualty. One of the quietest losses was trust. Not just trust in institutions, but trust in expertise, authority, and reassurance. When a system designed to help becomes the source of harm, future help becomes harder to accept. Some victims avoided medical care altogether. Others struggled to engage with therapy. Many felt uncomfortable in environments where power imbalance existed. These were not irrational responses. They were adaptations. The ethics question that never went away. MKUltra forced uncomfortable questions into public consciousness, questions that still have no clear answers. Is consent valid if key information is withheld? Can research be justified if harm is not immediately visible? Who decides when risk becomes acceptable? These questions extend beyond MKUltra. They challenge the foundation of ethical oversight itself. The illusion of safeguards. In the aftermath, new safeguards were introduced. Oversight committees, ethics boards, review processes. On paper, these measures promised protection. But for victims, safeguards felt abstract. They arrived after harm, after silence, after denial. Protection that comes too late does not feel like justice. The weight of not knowing everything. Even today, no one knows the full scope of MKUltra. How many people were affected? How many sites were involved? How much documentation was destroyed? These gaps matter. They leave room for doubt, speculation, and unresolved grief. For victims, not knowing can be as painful as knowing too much. Memory without records. Memory is fragile even under normal circumstances. When records disappear, memory carries an unfair burden. Victims were asked to prove experiences without evidence, to explain symptoms without context, to defend narratives shaped by confusion. History became something they felt, but could not always demonstrate. And history without documentation is easy to dismiss. Recognition without repair. In limited ways, MKUltra has been acknowledged. It exists in textbooks, in documentaries, in footnotes of institutional history. But acknowledgement does not equal restoration. Lost time cannot be returned. Trust cannot be retroactively rebuilt. Certainty cannot be reconstructed from fragments. Recognition came without repair. The question of accountability. One of the most troubling legacies of MKUltra is how responsibility dissolved. There was no singular figure to confront, no definitive moment of reckoning, no comprehensive apology that matched the scope of harm. Responsibility diffused across agencies, eras, and systems. And diffusion is a powerful shield. The victim's reality today. For some, life stabilized over time. For others, the effects never fully receded. What united them was not a shared experience, but a shared uncertainty. An unanswered question that lingered quietly in the background of their lives. How much of who I am was shaped by something I never agreed to? That question has no satisfying answer. Why MKUltra still matters. MKUltra is often framed as a historical anomaly, a mistake, a product of its time, an outlier. But history rarely repeats exactly. It echoes. The conditions that allowed MKUltra to exist, fear, secrecy, deference to authority, are not confined to the past. They are human patterns. The final cost, the true cost of MKUltra, cannot be measured statistically. It exists in years of confusion, lives lived with doubt, relationships shaped by silence, trust that never fully returned. These are not outcomes that appear in reports, but they are real. An ending without closure. There is no final revelation that resolves MKUltra. No single document that explains everything. No confession that restores what was taken. The story ends where many victims were left. with partial truth, with unanswered questions, with a sense that something fundamental was disrupted and never repaired. What remains? What remains is a warning, not about the past, but about power, secrecy, and the vulnerability of the human mind. When curiosity overrides ethics, when authority replaces consent, and when silence follows harm, the consequences do not disappear, they wait. This was MKUltra, not as a project, but as an experience lived by those who never volunteered to lose certainty about themselves. Some stories end, others leave a mark,